Three young men from America were on a trip to Mexico by boat, but their boat's engine broke down, leaving them stranded in Mexico. There, they met two brothers from their homeland. The brothers were supposed to help them return to America, but these brothers had a dangerous secret. This secret would lead all of them into serious trouble, and they would end up in one of Mexico's most dangerous prisons. Every day they spent in prison could have been their last. So, they decided to carry out one of the most challenging prison escapes. The hardships they would face in executing their plan were hair-raising, and the problems they would encounter would shock you. The story is very exciting, with fast-paced events and many surprises. Keep watching and enjoy. Our story took place in 1972. There were three American friends named Mike Cook, May Stanley, and Paul Smith. The pictures you see are real photos of them. As you can see, they are now old because this is a recent photo of them. Since the story is old, we will use actors' photos to fit the scenes we will see. In 1972, when these three friends were in their 20s, they had a boat with an engine and a sail. They were departing from America, specifically California, and heading to the western coast of Mexico, specifically to a coastal city called Mazatlan. At that time, there was not much enforcement on borders, especially maritime ones. Even at land crossings, Americans could enter and leave Mexico without a passport, making sea travel even easier. However, there were coast guards and patrols, especially to combat drug smugglers. So keep this in mind as it will play a role in the story. The three friends managed to travel all this distance without encountering any patrols or being stopped. Their trip was simply for fun. They were looking for adventure. However, when they reached the shores of the Mexican city of Mazatlan, their boat's engine broke down. The boat was already in bad shape. They had bought it cheaply because they didn't have a big budget. The engine didn't break down completely. It sometimes worked, sometimes didn't, but it was clearly at the end of its life. The three friends intended to continue their journey to southern Mexico, and possibly even further, wanting to spend the whole summer on an enjoyable sea adventure exploring new places. But this engine issue ruined their plans. They began to think about what to do. They had about $300 left, but that money was likely not enough to fix the engine. And if they did fix it, they would have no budget left to continue their trip. So, they started thinking of ways to earn some money. The three of them were using hashish and had bought some from the local city in Mexico. They got in a local taxi. The driver offered them hashish, and they bought from him. They noticed it was much cheaper compared to the hashish sold in America, almost 10 times cheaper. An idea struck them. Why not buy some hashish with the money they had, go back to America, sell it there, and then use the money to fix their boat and continue their journey? They went looking for the taxi driver who had sold them the hashish, and when they found him, they told him they wanted to buy a substantial amount of hashish and asked him to sell it to them or take them to someone who could. The taxi driver agreed. They got into his car, and he drove them through streets and roads until they left the town, heading up a rough mountain road far away from the city and people, ending up alone in a deserted area. At this point, the three friends started to feel anxious. They were afraid that the taxi driver was greedy for what they had and was taking them into a trap or an ambush. Or perhaps he had a group hiding and waiting for them between the mountains. After driving for a while along this mountain road, the taxi driver suddenly stopped and told them to get out of the taxi. The three of them got out, feeling nervous and apprehensive. They were very much expecting a gang to suddenly attack them. But after a few minutes, they saw a man approaching them with a donkey. The man was dressed like a farmer, and the donkey was loaded with large quantities of hashish. The three friends couldn't believe the amount they were seeing in front of them. They quickly realized that this group must have expected them to buy all of this hashish, even though they only had $300, as we mentioned before. Clearly, there had been a misunderstanding between them and the taxi driver. Apparently, the taxi driver, who didn't speak English fluently, assumed they wanted to buy a massive quantity. The three friends pulled out their $300 and told them it was all they had. The taxi driver and the farmer began arguing with them. It was clear they expected more money. The argument was difficult because they couldn't understand each other, with each one trying to speak in their own language. Finally, the three friends showed them their empty pockets and said they had nothing but the $300, and if they wanted to take it, they could. After this argument, the farmer, clearly frustrated, told them, "It's ok, just give him what you have." They handed him over the $300, and he gave them all the hashish he had. They ended up with 6 bags, each full of hashish. Each of them carried 2 bags. When they asked the taxi driver to take them back, it was clear he was still angry because he likely expected a nice tip for taking them there. But now it was obvious they had no money left. So, the taxi driver just took them down from the mountain, dropped them at the edge of the town, and asked them to get out of his car. They tried to argue with him about taking them back to the coast, or the port where their boat was docked. But the taxi driver kept pointing at the bags of hashish they were carrying, as if to say he couldn't drive them through the city with those bags. If the police saw him, he would be in big trouble, and there was no incentive for him to take that risk, especially since these broke guys wouldn't pay him anything. So he dropped them at the edge of the town and left them to walk to the coast or port. The 3 friends walked down the street, each carrying 2 bags. As they walked, they suddenly saw a policeman standing at the corner of the street ahead of them, about 20 meters away. They stopped for a moment to discuss what to do. The bags were literally open at the top, so if the policeman walked toward them and took a look, he would see the hashish clearly. The problem was also that they stood out compared to the locals. It was obvious they were white foreigners, which would draw more attention. Mike, who was somewhat the leader, told his friends that the policeman was watching them and likely had his eye on them. If they walked away or changed direction, it might raise his suspicions, and he could follow them. Mike suggested they continue walking in the same direction and pass by him casually as if nothing was wrong. The other 2 were hesitant but agreed in the end. They had to make a quick decision to avoid raising more suspicion. So the 3 of them continued walking and passed by the policeman, even greeting him as they walked past without being stopped. The 3 friends couldn't believe how they had managed to get through that situation. At that moment, they felt it was impossible for the policeman not to stop them. But somehow, they got away. Once they reached their boat, they opened the bags of hashish and started cleaning them, removing the stems and seeds. They estimated they had around 10 kilograms left. This was a huge amount of hashish, and they needed to find a way to hide it before returning to the United States. Although no one had stopped them on their way from the U.S. to Mexico, the Coast Guard patrols were everywhere, and they could be stopped at any moment. They thought about where they could hide the hashish and remembered hearing about people smuggling it inside surfboards. They were surfers and had surfboards, along with tools for board maintenance, and they were experienced with this. They opened one of the boards and cut off the top part with a knife. The inside of the board was filled with foam, which they removed and replaced with hashish. They stuffed the hashish inside the board, then used some glue and sanding tools to restore the board to its original state, or even better. Literally, anyone looking at the board wouldn't suspect a thing, and they were very proud of the result they had achieved. Now, after they had hidden the hashish, it was time to return. Their initial plan was to go back on their broken boat, but when they tried to start the engine, it wouldn't start. They kept trying many times until it ran briefly, and then stopped after a few minutes. It was clear that the engine was done for, and even if it worked a bit, it would be a deadly risk to take it out to sea. So, they started looking for a solution. They got off the boat and began to look around for someone who could help them. That's when they met 2 men, Frank Sierra and his brother Dan Sierra. Here you see their real, modern photos, but we will use pictures of actors to represent their younger selves. These 2 brothers were Americans like them. So when they met at the shore, they recognized each other and started talking. The 3 friends told them that their boat engine had broken down and they were stranded there. The brothers told them that they had a boat and were heading back to America, and if they wanted to come along and help with the boat, they were welcome. The three friends immediately agreed. The brothers told them to get their things ready and come to the boat the next morning, and then they would set off. The three friends were, of course, happy because they finally found a way to get back to America. They would bring along the surfboard with the hidden hashish and leave their boat there, and after selling the hashish in America, they would find a way to return to the boat and fix it. Actually, if they sold that amount of hashish, they probably wouldn't need that boat again. They could buy a much better one. The three friends thought they were keeping a secret from the brothers, but what they didn't know was that the brothers were actually hiding a bigger and more dangerous secret from them. The next morning, the three friends went to the brothers' boat. There they met the brothers, sat with them, laughed and chatted. One of the brothers, Frank, even gave them some hashish, and they smoked together. The three friends felt at ease with the brothers when they started smoking hashish with them. They thought the brothers were adventurers like them, even though the brothers were older. What the three friends didn't know was that these brothers were actually major hashish smugglers, and the boat they were on was loaded with a massive amount of hashish, about 1,000 kilos, a full ton. In fact, the brothers had come to Mexico to smuggle this quantity. They bought this ton of hashish for about $30,000, and when they would sell it in America, they would likely make 10 times that amount, around $300,000. And of course, the value of money back then was lower. If we calculate it with today's inflation, $300,000 could be around $2 million today, which is a significant amount. So when the brothers saw the three friends enjoying themselves and smoking hashish with them, they confided in them. They told them they were smuggling hashish, a large amount, a full ton, and needed their help. First, they would help sail the boat, and then, when they reached America, they needed help transporting the hashish to their warehouses. The hashish was packed in wrapped bags like cubes and distributed inside the boat. Of course, a large amount like this was impossible to hide. The three friends were shocked when they heard this. There was a ton of hashish on the boat they were on. They thought they were smuggling a large amount because they had 10 kilos hidden in the surfboard. The first thing they thought about was the high risk involved. If they were caught by the Coast Guards, whether the Mexican or American Coast Guards, the punishment would be severe, especially with such a large quantity. They would be treated as major drug smugglers. In Mexico, the punishment for smuggling hashish could be up to 25 years, and many American smugglers were caught during this period, with a large number ending up in Mexican prisons. This was the first thing that came to the minds of the three friends. It would be a disaster if they were caught. But Frank, the older brother, told them they would each get $10,000 if they helped them. At this point, the three friends exchanged looks among themselves, and without hesitation, agreed, forgetting any risks involved. $10,000 each was a tempting amount for them. The five of them set off on the boat together, heading back to America. The journey would take a long time, more than a week at sea, especially if they wanted to follow safe routes away from Coast Guard patrol points. Day after day passed, and everything was fine. The trip was going smoothly, and they were making their way to America without problems. On the seventh day, disaster struck. That night, everyone was asleep except for one person steering the boat, Paul Smith. It was a calm night. Everything was fine, and they were making their way like every night. Suddenly, without warning, there was a violent collision. The four who were sleeping were literally thrown from their spots. Even the hashish bags were thrown around, and everything turned into chaos within seconds. Water started pouring in, and the boat began to sink. The boat had either hit a rock or something in the water. Now, each of the five people on the boat was trying to save themselves because the water rose quickly and reached their necks. They managed to get out of the boat before it completely sank, but now they were stranded in the middle of the sea, struggling against the waves in the darkness around them. They couldn't see anything, but they tried to stay afloat with the waves, as the waves would surely head towards the shore. An hour or two passed like this, and finally they heard the sound of waves crashing, meaning there was a shore ahead. But they didn't know if it was a sandy beach or rocks that would break them. They couldn't see anything in the pitch dark. They were tossed around by the waves, but luckily for them, it was a beach. They were exhausted and worn out, and as soon as they crawled onto the shore, they fell asleep on the sand. Their condition was miserable, to say the least, and they didn't wake up until the sun rose the next day. Of course, they woke up completely exhausted and barely able to move, but what they saw in front of them shocked them. They weren't the only thing the waves had carried to the shore. All their belongings from the boat were also washed ashore. Among these items were the kilograms of hashish that had been on the boat. The scene was crazy. Dozens, or even hundreds of bags, all filled with hashish, were scattered along the beach. The 5 guys were stunned by the sight. If any locals or fishermen came to the beach, the police would be called immediately, and there was a high chance they would be arrested. So, they quickly started running along the beach, gathering these bags. Some of you might wonder why they didn't just run away and leave the hashish behind. The answer is that if anyone found that much hashish on the beach, they would call the police right away. The police would likely search the area, and given that they were foreigners with white skin in a rough state, they would stand out and be easily found. So they tried to collect the bags as quickly as possible and started digging a hole to bury them. The 5 guys dug with their hands because they had no tools, but before they could dig a big hole, they saw some villagers walking along the beach. They buried as much as they could in the small hole they had dug. 3 of them continued burying the bags, while the other 2, Frank and Mike, went to greet the villagers and distract them with conversation to give their friends time to bury the rest of the bags. Frank knew a little Spanish, so he spoke to the villagers. The 3 who were burying the bags covered the hole with some sand and tree branches because they didn't have time, and the bags were almost at the edge of the hole. Anyone walking by would easily see the bags, and there were probably still other bags on the beach that they hadn't managed to gather. Frank, with his broken Spanish, asked the villagers to take them to their village or the nearest town and explained that their boat had sunk. The villagers had a small truck and agreed to help, so the 5 of them climbed into the truck bed. The villagers told them the nearest town was about 50 kilometers away. As the truck started moving along the forest road, the 5 began to feel relieved, thinking they had escaped the situation, and that no one would find the pile of hashish bags until they had left the area. The truck drove a long distance before suddenly stopping. The group was puzzled about what was happening, and then they heard the sound of a car approaching from the opposite direction, honking and flashing its lights, speeding towards them. The young men realized there was trouble and that they likely hadn't escaped. The car stopped in front of their truck, and several armed police officers got out, pointing their weapons at them. The 5 guys had no choice but to raise their hands and surrender to the officers. At that moment, they knew their fate in this country would be very, very bad. The police took them directly to the station and put them in a cell. It wasn't long before some officers came and dragged them one by one to meet the chief officer. In the interrogation room, they were seated in front of the officer and given papers to sign. These papers appeared to be confessions of guilt, written in Spanish, and none of them could read Spanish. Naturally, their initial reaction was to refuse, but they didn't realize they weren't in America. If any of them hesitated or tried to speak, they were yelled at, threatened, and even had guns pointed at their heads, making it clear that signing was not optional but obligatory. So all 5 of them signed the confessions under duress, knowing that by signing, they were sealing their fate. After signing, the police immediately took them to a nearby prison, a prison that was evidently tough, not because it was heavily fortified or equipped with the latest security systems, but because it was very primitive, making it more dangerous and harsher. Many Americans imprisoned in Mexican jails experienced the worst things imaginable. The prison where the 5 young men were placed was literally a jungle. They would throw you into the yard and lock the door behind you, leaving you to choose your cell and fend for yourself. It was as if they were putting a herd of sheep in a pen, and the place was overcrowded, with more inmates than the facility could handle. When a new prisoner arrived, all the inmates would surround and stare at him, and he was lucky if none of them laid a hand on him or hurt him. Most of the inmates in this prison were drug addicts with ties to gangs and criminal activities. It was an incredibly terrible place. Fortunately for these young men, they were in a group of 5, making it difficult for anyone to single them out. But imagine their feelings amidst these criminals who didn't even speak their language. The 5 found a small cell and stayed there. The first night was the hardest for them. They didn't know if they could survive in this place or how long they would be there. They realized the coming period would be one of the toughest in their lives. Despite the depressing atmosphere, they immediately began discussing their next move. The first idea proposed was to try to escape from this place. The prison was tough, but also very chaotic, with no real system, so they were sure they could find security gaps. The next morning, they started exploring the prison, looking for a way to escape. The first thing they noticed was that the facility was surrounded by 2 walls, an inner wall and an outer wall. The inner wall was about 8 meters high, with sharp glass pieces on top to prevent climbing. The outer wall was where armed guards stood. These 2 walls ruled out the possibility of escaping over them. The only way out was through the classic method, digging a tunnel underground. But the problem was that the ground beneath them wasn't dirt but concrete. The task was difficult and complicated from the start. However, being Americans, all of them had seen The Great Escape, one of the most famous prison escape movies of that time. The movie, released in 1963, was inspired by the true story of 76 prisoners escaping from Hitler's prison during World War II. These 5 had seen the movie, in which the prisoners escaped through an underground tunnel, and they knew it was based on a true story. This gave them motivation and inspiration, making them feel they could do it despite the obstacles they would face. The obstacles were many, starting with the concrete floor they needed to break through. The tunnel had to start from their cell, pass under the bathrooms, and then go under the inner wall. After that, there was a space between the inner and outer walls, which they had to cross before going under the outer wall to come out on the other side. They estimated the distance they needed to dig to be between 10 and 15 meters. First, they had to break through the concrete floor, which meant they needed tools, a hammer-like tool, and something for breaking like a screwdriver. One of them, Mike, noticed some workers doing maintenance on one of the prison walls. He saw some small stones they were using and discreetly took one. This stone would serve as a hammer. Now they needed a screwdriver or a substitute tool. All they could get was a butter knife, a non-sharp knife, which they bought from another inmate. You might wonder where they got the money. Most likely, the brothers Frank and Dan had some cash, and they had connections in Mexico who could help them out. With a stone and a butter knife, they could use the knife and hit it with the stone to break the concrete. These were not the best tools, but they had to make do with what they had. The best place to dig in their cell was near the wall, the closest point to the outside. They moved one of the beds, marked the spot, and set up a makeshift tent to hide the person digging. This tent was just a regular sheet. The person digging would go under it and start hitting the concrete with the stone and knife. They also established a watch system to avoid getting caught. At least 2 people would stand outside the window and door to alert the digger if anyone approached. They were also monitoring the sound of digging. If it got too loud, they would signal the digger to reduce the noise or wait until there was enough noise outside to cover their digging sounds. The process of drilling through the cement was exhausting and very slow. They were trying to dig in a square or rectangular shape to create a sufficient opening as an entrance to the tunnel. This cement-breaking task took them a full 6 weeks. Finally, after all this time and effort, they managed to open a suitable hole in the floor. However, what awaited them under this hole was nothing short of disappointing. The ground beneath the cement was all muddy and waterlogged. It wasn't dry soil that they could dig through. This was a shock to them, but they didn't give up immediately. They decided to try to dry out the mud and turn it into soil, thinking that maybe the water was only in the top layer. So, they began scooping water from the ground, putting it into a bucket, and pouring the bucket into the toilets. They kept at this for 3 days, going back and forth trying to dry out the water in the ground, but it was clear that it wasn't working. The ground wouldn't dry, and the more they scooped out, the more water surfaced. It became obvious that something was soaking the ground from within, and no matter how much they tried to dry it, they wouldn't succeed. At this point, they felt despair. There was no way to dig the tunnel. So they sealed the hole with the cement cover, put the bed back in place, and gave up on the idea, resigning themselves to the fact that they would remain in this prison for an unknown duration. Time passed slowly, and each day was more boring than the last. At least when they were digging, they had a goal to work towards. Now their lives were empty, especially since this prison had no jobs, workshops, or activities to pass the time. For this reason, most of the inmates were using drugs, which were available to any prisoner with money. The guards didn't search them or even care. The prisoners literally used drugs right in front of them. The 5 guys tried to walk around the prison yard all day just to pass the time without getting consumed by their thoughts. In a place like this, you could easily go insane or take the dark path and start using dangerous drugs like heroin, which could literally kill you. 5 months passed in this state without any goals and without knowing their exact situation. None of the officials or officers talked to them or told them anything clear, in addition to the language barrier that made things even more difficult. But after these 5 months, something surprising happened in prison. The water they used in the toilets and bathrooms suddenly stopped. Then the news spread that one of the main pipes supplying water to the prison had broken or had a major leak, so they cut off the water to fix the problem. A day passed, then 2 and 3, and the water was still cut off. Suddenly, one of the 5, Mike, had an idea. He remembered the hole they had dug and the water in it, and he told his friends that the water cutoff might have dried the ground, and maybe the broken pipe they were fixing was the reason the ground was always muddy and wet. Immediately, they moved the bed and opened the cement cover. The surprise was that the ground was dry. It was soil. At that moment, they were all overjoyed and said to each other, "Let's go. It's time to work." They quickly got a slightly large plastic bucket and started filling it with soil from the hole. The digging process was quick, especially at the beginning. In just a few hours, they managed to dig almost a meter down. Of course, the digging was still vertical downward. They hadn't started digging the horizontal tunnel yet, but after digging to a depth of about a meter, they began horizontal digging. However, as they progressed, the soil became harder, so they used the small knife they had to continue the horizontal digging. This slowed down the process a bit, especially since the tunnel was narrow, just wide enough for their shoulders. It was a bit frightening, like digging while inside a coffin. But of course, the situation they had endured in the prison over the past months gave them the determination to continue. And what motivated them even more was that the digging speed was still relatively fast. If they kept up this pace, they could finish digging the tunnel in about a month. Such an operation couldn't go off without problems, and the first big problem they faced was where to put the soil they extracted from the tunnel. The prison yard was all concrete, so they couldn't just dump the soil anywhere. Everyone would notice. The only place that came to their minds was the toilets and bathrooms, but of course, they couldn't dump large amounts in the toilets as they would quickly get clogged, and the inmates and guards would notice. They decided the best thing to do was to hide the soil under their beds, in the same room they were digging in. It's true it was a high-risk move, and the space could fill up quickly, and there was also the risk of sudden inspections by the guards. But they had no other options. Their only choice was to focus and try to finish the digging as quickly as possible. The faster they finished, the lower their chances of getting caught. Of course, the digging process was done in shifts among them. Each time, One of them would go in to dig for 5 or 6 hours, and there was always someone outside to help remove the soil from the tunnel. Almost a week had passed, and they were still at it, doing a good job. They had dug about 3 or 4 meters, which was a reasonable distance. As mentioned before, they would need to pass under the bathrooms because they were in their path and next to their cell. One of them, Paul, was digging inside the tunnel when suddenly he hit something. He came out of the tunnel with a pale, yellow face. His friend Mike, who was standing outside helping to clear the dirt from the tunnel, said to him, "You look pale. What's wrong?" Paul replied, "I think I hit a sewer pipe and broke it, and now it's leaking into the tunnel." The smell immediately started wafting from the tunnel opening. Even though the entire prison already smelled bad, if you entered their cell at that moment, you would instantly notice a stronger and fouler odor. The two of them quickly informed their friends, who came over to see the disaster for themselves. It truly was a disaster in every sense of the word. As soon as they removed the cover from the tunnel, they smelled the stench. The problem was that even if they tried to clean the tunnel and remove the water and filth, where would they put it? If they dumped it into the toilets, it would just come back through the broken pipe and enter the tunnel again, especially since this was the main sewer pipe for all the bathrooms, meaning all the prisoners' waste passed through it. Within just a few hours, the tunnel was filled with filth. At least the ground was absorbing some of the water to an extent, so the tunnel didn't fill up with water, but it was still full of filth. If they wanted to stop this filth, they had to repair the pipe and seal the break. They needed to do this quickly to prevent the tunnel from filling with more filth and to avoid anyone discovering the problem. If anyone discovered that the sewage wasn't being properly managed and the smell spread everywhere, the guards might come to investigate. This would be a huge problem, and they would be exposed and spend the rest of their lives in this prison. The problem was that none of the 5 were willing to repair the pipe. Each one kept passing the responsibility to the other, and no one wanted to do the job. Seeing that they were stuck, they decided to try bringing in someone new, a 6th member who might do the dirty job. Immediately, they thought of a prisoner named Benny. Benny was also an American prisoner they had gotten to know over the past few months. He was an addict who was always stoned, and they felt he might agree to do the dirty job. They'd brought Benny to their room, showed him the tunnel opening, and said, "We are digging a tunnel and plan to escape, but as you can see, we have a problem. The sewer pipe broke and is leaking into the tunnel. If you go in and fix the pipe, we'll take you with us when we escape, and you won't have to do any other work afterward. We'll finish the digging. All you need to do is go in now and repair the pipe." As soon as Benny saw the hole and smelled the stench, he said, "Are you crazy? No way I'm doing that." The 5 of them kept talking to him, trying to convince him. Frank said, "I'll reward you when we get out. I'll give you money and more weed than you've ever seen in your life." Benny was hesitant. The task was difficult and disgusting, but the rewards were tempting. In the end, he said, "Fine, I'll do it." The 5 of them cheered and encouraged Benny, calling him a hero. Before Benny could enter the tunnel, they needed to give him something to fix the break. Somehow, they'd managed to procure some cement powder, probably by paying off some workers. They mixed the cement with water and put it in a coffee can. Benny was supposed to take this can into the tunnel, reach the broken pipe, and seal the break with cement. The poor Benny prepared himself, took a deep breath because he obviously wouldn't be able to breathe through his nose, and entered the tunnel. It was a situation no one would envy. As he went in, he wanted to vomit from the sheer disgust, but he fought through it and made his way to the pipe. He applied the cement to the break, ensuring it was sealed tightly. They also asked him to try to gather the filth, especially the large pieces, and put them in the can on his way back out, trying to clean up as much as possible. Benny emerged from the tunnel opening, his whole body covered in filth. The others were ready with a bucket of water for him to clean himself. They eagerly asked if he had fixed the pipe, and he replied that everything was fine. Thus, Benny earned his place among the team, and their number became 6. They were all happy that they had finally solved this problem. They waited a few days for the tunnel to dry completely. Even after it dried, the smell remained terrible, but at least they could continue digging again. Of course, they lost valuable time because of this problem, and the longer it took, the greater the chance of them being discovered. Time was a critical factor, so they returned with all their strength to continue digging the tunnel. They needed to finish as quickly as possible. They continued digging day after day, working about 18 hours a day, of course, taking shifts among themselves. The tunnel reached a length of about 6 meters, and they estimated that they had bypassed the inner wall, the first wall. They were now most likely in the area between the inner and outer walls of the prison. They weren't sure about the exact length of this area. Mike had a small wooden flute, which he modified by attaching a small mirror to create a tool similar to a periscope. This allowed them to look above the ground from within the tunnel. Mike crawled to the end of the tunnel, made a small hole with the butter knife they had, and discovered they were very close to the surface. Even though they had initially dug about 1 meter deep, the ground levels were uneven. Importantly, they were now very close to the surface. After making the small hole, Mike used the periscope and saw they were very close to the outer wall, the wall they needed to get past. He returned to his companions and told them they were only about 2 or 3 meters away from bypassing the outer wall. Encouraged, they decided to push harder and speed up the digging, each working as hard as they could to dig the most distance possible. As they neared the end of the tunnel, they needed to prepare for the escape phase. This task fell primarily to the brothers Frank and Dan, especially Dan, who had been living in Mexico for years and had contacts who could help them. Dan arranged for his contacts outside the prison to have 2 cars ready for their escape once they got out. Since there were 6 of them, they needed at least 2 cars. The cars were to wait at a specific location near the prison after 3 nights, as they anticipated escaping on the 3rd night. The cars and drivers were supposed to be at the agreed-upon spot after 3 nights. Motivated by this deadline, they pushed themselves harder to finish on time. However, the next night, something unexpected happened. It started to rain. The person inside the tunnel could literally hear the rain above his head because, as mentioned, there was very little distance between the tunnel and the surface. Water began seeping through the periscope hole, and suddenly the hole widened, allowing a lot of water to enter the tunnel. The person in the tunnel quickly got out and informed his companions of the new disaster. They were all worried the tunnel would collapse, as they were sure it couldn't bear the weight of the accumulating water, especially since the layer between the tunnel and the surface was very thin. Worse, the tunnel was getting soaked from the inside, and they had no doubt it would collapse. They waited anxiously in their cell, deeply depressed, expecting the guards to discover the tunnel at any moment. The rain continued through the night until the next morning. When the sun came up, they were still waiting for the guards to storm in. But surprisingly, no one came. They were astonished that the tunnel had seemingly held up despite all the rain. Literally, they were incredibly lucky. They went back into the tunnel after the rain stopped and found that it hadn't collapsed. There was water and dampness, but it was still intact. They hurried to remove the water and dry the tunnel as much as they could because they had to resume digging quickly. The escape was supposed to happen that night. This was the night they had arranged with the drivers who would be waiting outside. So they immediately resumed digging, each working an hour or 2 before switching shifts to avoid exhaustion. They kept digging until around 2 a.m. Finally, they felt they had reached a spot they believed was past the outer prison wall. Ideally, if they had more time, they would have dug further to distance themselves from the wall and the prison, but they were out of time and already running late. So they lined up in the tunnel, one after the other, and did something clever before entering. They wore their clothes inside out, so that when they crawled through the tunnel, the inside would get dirty, and they could flip them back to appear cleaner once they emerged on the other side. The 6 of them crawled into the tunnel with the end still sealed, planning to open it only at the moment of escape. The person leading was Mays, who had somehow obtained a mask while in prison. His job was to open the exit at the end of the tunnel, and the mask would help protect his face from the dirt and dust that would fall as he broke through. Opening the exit was not an easy task. The ground above them was somewhat solid, so Mace kept hitting and digging with a butter knife, while his friends waited behind him in the tunnel. He continued digging for about 15 minutes until the exit finally began to open in front of him. They all got excited and happy at that moment, but when Mace poked his head out of the hole, he quickly pulled back in and told them that it was bright outside. The prism lights were literally right above them. He said that if they came out, any passerby or guard would see them immediately. His friends asked if he had seen anyone around or if the place was empty. He told them that it seemed empty, as he hadn't seen anyone. The group agreed that there was no turning back now. They had to get out. Mays was the first to climb out of the hole, followed quickly by his friends, one after the other. As soon as each one got out, they hid behind the wall to avoid being seen by any guards likely stationed above. Now all 6 were outside the tunnel, hidden behind the outer wall. Mays, who was in the lead, peeked around the corner to assess the situation. The area was completely exposed to the guards. They literally had to walk past the main gate of the prison to reach the street. At that moment, Mike remembered the trick they used when carrying bags of hashish, walking confidently and calmly right next to the police officer. They realized they had to use the same tactic to get out of this place. Quickly, they turned their clothes inside out to the cleaner side, dusted themselves off as best they could, and walked calmly, pretending to be locals. They wished they could run, but they knew that any sudden movement would draw attention immediately. What helped them, luckily, was that the prison was surrounded by residential areas. It wasn't an isolated prison in the middle of nowhere. They hoped that even if a guard saw them, they would think they were ordinary people returning home, despite it being around 3 a.m. They kept walking quietly past the prison until they had put a reasonable distance between themselves and the prison. Then they started running, feeling elated. They knew they had finally gained their freedom without any guard seeing or suspecting them. Now they had to quickly reach the place where the cars were waiting for them before dawn, and before the guards discovered their escape. They'd reached the agreed-upon place, feeling excited, but their excitement quickly faded when they didn't find the cars there. Dan was the one who had arranged for the cars, so his friends asked him, "Where are the cars?" He told them not to worry, and that there was a second location he had agreed upon with the drivers, in case they couldn't reach this place. The second location was near the railroad tracks, so the 6 of them followed Dan and kept running for a long distance. Dawn was beginning to break, and they started to worry that police patrols might begin searching for them if the guards discovered their escape. The drivers were supposed to look for them on this road next to the railroad tracks, so the 6 of them stood by the side of the road, waiting. Suddenly, they saw 2 cars approaching from a distance. They all turned to Dan and asked, "Are those your friends coming?" Dan kept looking, waiting for the cars to get closer to confirm if they were his friends or someone else. Within moments, he smiled and said, "Yes, it's them." At that moment, the 6 of them were indescribably happy. They knew they had truly escaped the hell they had endured for 7 months in prison. At this point, the 6 of them split up, said their goodbyes, and each group of 3 got into a car. The original 3 friends rode together in one car, while the 2 brothers and Benny rode in the second car. As for where they went, Benny got off after a while and went his own way, and the brothers gave him the hashish and the reward they had promised him. The 2 brothers themselves were wanted in the U.S. on charges of drug and hashish trafficking, so they headed to southern Mexico and didn't return to the U.S. As for the 3 friends, they decided to return to the U.S. and crossed the land border. They still had their passports because, even in the Mexican prison, their passports were not taken away, as these were their only forms of identification. Fortunately, their passports remained with them, and when they reached the border, The guards let them through immediately. They faced no obstacles and returned to their country safely after this ordeal and the incredible adventure they had experienced. We have come to the end of our story. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.